All right, let's see if we can get this a little closer. Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back. Another episode of Sunshine Consulting. If you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you can be the most financially literate person you know. It's no coincidence that Sunshine Consulting is based in the beautiful state of Florida, the Sunshine State. And well, we just passed a new law that minimum wage is going to raise annually. I think it's $1 until it hits 15. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means for everybody. And I'm also going to teach a little supply and demand economics right here. So I got this whiteboard here. I apologize. I'm going to try to speak into the microphone as much as I can, but I'm also going to try to show you what's going on here. So for anybody that's never been introduced to supply and demand, let me give a quick overview. So right here on the vertical axis, we have price, and over here on the horizontal axis, we have quantity. And we have two lines in the middle, which are a representation of a demand in the economy and a supply in the economy. So I'm just going to ask you a question. When you go to your local supermarket and something is on sale, are you more likely to buy it? Obviously, yes, right? So we know that there's a relationship between price and the amount demanded, the quantity. Well, this demand curve shows this. As price decreases, we have an increase in the quantity demanded. And it's reversed for supply. So think about if you're a business, would you produce more of something if you could create more of a profit? Absolutely, there's a higher incentive. So as the price goes up, as suppliers can get more, there's more of a quantity that they're willing to produce. That's why we have an upward facing supply curve. And then right here where these two curves meet, we call this economic equilibrium. And I represent that by P star and Q star right there. I really hope you guys can see this all right. P star and Q star, which represent where the price level is currently at in the economy. And although we don't have numbers, this is just a representative of it. So now let's talk about what happens when minimum wage goes up. So when minimum wage goes up, there are a few things that are going to happen. And right now, I'm just going to keep it to Florida. Okay. So in Florida, minimum wage affects a lot of jobs. Well, the first thing that's going to happen is as these jobs start raising, the price level is also going to raise because the biggest input to most industries is in fact human labor, is the hourly wage. And so that takes a huge effect on the price that suppliers can accept to make a profit. So when we look at this, there are certain things that shift each curve. For the demand curve, an increase in demand could be led to a population shift, right? If there's a huge campaign for healthier foods, the demand for healthier foods is going to increase. Or when you look at, when all of these negative advertisements for cigarettes came out, there was a decrease in demand, right? So consumer preference is a huge one. But let's shift over to supply. What are things that shift supply? And the biggest one is the things that are input into it, which is in what we're talking about, labor. So which way is this supply curve going to shift? And that is to the left. So I'm going to label this right here supply 2. So now we have the same demand curve because nothing's happened to demand just yet. And we have this supply 1, our original, or we can say supply star. And we shift to the left and go to supply 2, which leads to what happens to quantity and what happens to price. So I just circled those to try to make them easier for you guys to see. But basically what happens is we have an increase in price. And because now there's an increase in price, we have less of a quantity that's desired because things are more expensive. Now, there is a serious lag time when it comes to some of these things. So think about all of the minimum wage jobs that are now going to be paying more and the price level is also going to increase. Well, there are people that have salaries that don't get adjusted automatically. So it's not like all of these things happen instantaneously. It's minimum wage is going to rise, and then you might start seeing the price level rise once firms start to realize this, right? And as everything starts raising, Well, now that the price level's going up, what happens to everybody else? Because there are a lot of people that are fixed on an hourly wage and the minimum wage doesn't bump them up at all just yet. Well, now what happens is everybody's buying power decreases, it diminishes, right? Because if you have $50,000 a year and you can buy X amount of, let's say, potatoes, well, if the price of potatoes go up and you keep that 50,000, right, you're gonna have less potatoes at the end of the year. And so what this is really doing is it's giving a big boost to the people that are on minimum wage or that are gonna be affected by this. And it's kind of limiting the, I don't wanna say prosperity, but the buying power of people with higher wages. And so what's eventually gonna happen is everybody's wage should catch up to this. But this is gonna take a while. It's not like this is instantaneous. So that's pretty much the basics of what's gonna happen in Florida. Let me see if I wrote anything else down. And because a lot of firms aren't going to want to raise their price level, they're gonna wanna keep their price level the same. This could also lead to higher unemployment. This is one of the realities of increasing wage when certain businesses can't support the higher wage, or you don't feel comfortable paying, $20 for an ice cream cone, but that's what they have to charge. So, you might see it close down in certain ice cream shops. Well, it just depends on the industry. That's just an example. I don't want to say ice cream's going away. It's a bad day, right? So now let's talk about what happens outside of Florida, right? Because now we have a higher price level in Florida. Well, this is the quantity and price levels of a local economy. But what happens when Florida raises its minimum wage and not everywhere else raises their minimum wage? Well, now everybody else can produce it cheaper. Because if our minimum wage is $15 an hour, but country X, let's say China, right? Their minimum wage is $10 an hour still. I don't know what it is. They're gonna have the advantage to produce it more cheap for us. So when you have competing firms, you have a local producer, and this is something that happens in the real world right now with other countries, is you have another country that can produce it cheaper. So while we're trying to produce it at P Circle, there's another country that can produce it down here. And so what happens to local businesses? What happens to local manufacturers? And I do want to add, I had to look this up because I didn't know it personally. Manufacturing makes up 8% of the Florida economy. So it's not going to have a huge drastic effect on manufactured products in Florida, but 8% still almost 10, Anyways, so what's going to happen is when importers can buy the product at a lower price than we can produce it here, we're going to see a lot more unemployment. We're going to see Florida manufacturing companies go under. They're not going to be able to sustain themselves with people importing other prices. And then there are some ways that the government can, subsidize. They can put a tax on all imported products to make it more fair for local producers. But then that's a different conversation about, is that efficient, right? Because technically it's not efficient. And I can make another video about that. But another thing that's probably more pertinent to all of my generation's future is the use of technology. And what's going to be super fascinating is if the minimum wage goes up, right? How hard would it be to replace, let's say, a burger flipper at McDonald's with a robot? Robot doesn't cost anything an hour. So you have a capital outlay of whatever the robot is, right? You have maintenance maybe every week, every month or whatever, but it's going to be a lot cheaper. And so when we see the minimum wage go up, we might see more incentives for robots, for AI and things like that. What else? So we might see a higher amount of imports. We might see more tech. But I do want to say that Florida has a super high tourism industry. And so it's also the #1 move to state. Thankfully, no income tax, right? No state income tax, I should say. And so what happens here is we talked about supply, right? Well, in the earlier part of the video, I talked about how demand is also affected. So now we have, let me get rid of this real quick. Pause 1 second. So we previously moved our supply, right? Because we know we're increasing the amount of inputs, the dollar of inputs, so we're gonna have a higher supply curve here. Well, now what happens if we shift demand because we have all these people moving to Florida? Florida's a beautiful place. I admire it. I appreciate you guys wanting to move here. It's a beautiful place. I can't blame you. So we have the demand curve. So what happens when we increase our demand curve now? All I have is these skinny markers. I really hope you guys can see it. But what ends up happening is now we shift our demand to the right because there's a higher demand for things. So now we come back to this, and this also depends heavily on what actually affects the actual numbers of supply and demand. This is just a representation of what could happen. So now what happens is our quantity increases because there's a higher demand, and now firms can get a higher price for it. So we're actually at this higher price point than we were. And we're back at our equilibrium quantity. And so these are some of the things that can shift supply and demand. These are some of the things that we could see happening in Florida. So truthfully, if I could give any advice, I would say that you need to negotiate higher wages, talk to your bosses about the effects of this, and start to look about how your buying power changes. And there's a thing called the Consumer Price Index, the CPI, and you can look at that. I don't know if they have it for Florida specifically, but I know they have it for the US. And so these are things that you can measure your income level to your buying power. And I would start trying to negotiate your wage for that. I would start looking at retailers that might already be struggling and that are going to struggle more because of the increase in minimum wage. And there are definitely going to be some economic opportunities and some downfalls. So hope you learned a thing or two. And if you didn't, leave a comment and find out what you really want to know. I can tell you anything as long as I look it up beforehand, right? But feel free to subscribe, comment, ask me questions. Thanks for listening to another video of Sunshine Consulting, and I'll see you next week. Cheers.